Have you ever stopped to think, really think, about what the key geographical region is for this century, the 21st? We often see maps focused on the Atlantic, maybe the Pacific.
Right, those are the traditional views.
Exactly. But today we're doing a deep dive into Robert D. Kaplan's really insightful book, Monsoon, The Indian Ocean and the Future of American Power. And Kaplan makes this powerful argument.
He really does.
He says, the greater Indian Ocean, that huge sweep of water from the Horn of Africa stretching all the way east to Indonesia, that this area could define our century, like Europe defined the last one.
It's a provocative thought.
It is. And it's not just water, right? It's where you see this complex conversation between Western and Islamic worlds. It's where global energy routes snake through. And it's where India and China are quietly but definitely rising.
That's spot on. And our mission here for you listening is really to unpack Kaplan's main ideas, his core points, maybe give you a shortcut to understanding why this region matters so much.
A shortcut sounds good.
Well, yeah, Kaplan points out America has historically looked towards the Atlantic and Pacific. It's a kind of bias, almost, that often means the Indian Ocean gets split right down the middle on our maps.
I've seen that. It makes it seem less important somehow.
Exactly. And recognizing that historical blind spot is, well, it's crucial for understanding what's happening now.
Okay. So stick with us, because we think you'll find some surprising connections here, things that might just shift how you view the world map. Let's start with the history, the deep roots of the Indian Ocean. It's got such a long story. The Arabs called it al-Bahr al-Hindi.
The Indian Sea, right?
And you could literally trace the spread of Islam across these waters, can't you? From the Red Sea out towards India, even as far as Indonesia. It's fundamental.
It is. And what's really amazing, historically speaking, are the monsoon winds. Kaplan talks about them as a kind of unique technical achievement for ancient sailors. Well, they were predictable. They allowed for reliable long-distance trade way back when. It basically knitted this vast ocean together, made it a symbol of universal humanity, as Kaplan puts it, long before other oceans were easily crossed.
So Indians, Chinese, Arabs, Persians, all trading.
Yeah, exactly. A huge network of connections built on trade, those winds, even the historic Hajj pilgrimage routes played a part. It was interconnected for centuries.
Okay, so fast forward to today. What about its modern strategic weight?
Well, this is where it gets pretty stark. You look around the rim of the Indian Ocean. You've got the troubled nations in the Horn of Africa dealing with violence, famine.
Somalia, Yemen.
Right. Then you have the major geopolitical hotspots like Iraq and Iran right there. And Pakistan. Kaplan uses this really vivid phrase. He calls it a fissuring fundamentalist cauldron.
Wow. What does he mean by fissuring?
He means it's being pulled apart from within. Deep ethnic tensions, sectarian violence, political instability, all feeding into this volatile mix that fuels extremism. It's not a stable picture.
No, it sounds incredibly tense.
And then you add the choke points, these narrow straits that are vital for global trade. We're talking Bab el-Mandeb, Hormuz, and Malacca.
How vital are we talking?
Think about this. 40% of all the world's seaborne crude oil has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. 40%.
That's huge.
It is. And the Strait of Malacca, it handles something like 50% of the world's entire merchant fleet capacity. So Kaplan's not exaggerating when he calls the Indian Ocean the globe's busiest and most important interstate. It's the central artery for commerce.
Okay, so with all that traffic and instability, how are the big powers playing this? Let's talk about China first. They seem to be everywhere.
They are definitely making their presence felt. Look at the huge deepwater port projects they're building. Gwadar in Pakistan is one. Hambantota in Sri Lanka is another.
And Kaplan says these aren't just commercial ports. He calls them dual-use civilian military facilities.
That's the key phrase. It's not about China wanting outright control, not like an old colonial power maybe. It's more subtle. It's about getting access, reliable access, to modern ports in friendly countries right along that southern edge of Eurasia.
Which gives them a much bigger footprint along those sea lanes we just talked about.
Exactly. And being able to protect those sea lanes, well, that makes a major bureaucratic sales argument back in Beijing for building up a proper blue water navy.
A blue water navy meaning one that can operate far from home.
Precisely. Not just coastal defense, but projecting power across the deep oceans. And you have to connect this to China's energy needs. Up to 85% of their imported oil and gas comes through the Indian Ocean, mostly via Malacca.
So they feel vulnerable. They need to protect those routes.
It's a powerful driver for their naval expansion, no question.
Okay, what about India, the other giant in the region? How are they responding? Kaplan talks about India's horizontal expansion. What's that about?
Horizontal means they're not just growing stronger internally, but they're actively pushing their influence outwards, sideways across the map, from the Middle East, across the ocean, towards Southeast Asia.
So economically, politically.
Both. Their trade with the Gulf countries, with Iran, it's booming. They've got a big natural gas deal with Iran, and they're developing the Chabahar port there, which is quite significant strategically.
Chabahar in Iran. Isn't that seen as a counter to Gwadar in Pakistan?
Very much so. It gives India sea access that bypasses Pakistan. And this fits into Kaplan's idea that Iran and Afghanistan can serve as a kind of strategic rear base for India against Pakistan.
Interesting. Despite India having difficult land borders.
Right. Kaplan notes India is bedeviled by land borders with countries he bluntly calls supreme messes like Pakistan. So projecting power effectively often means doing it at sea. India is really well placed geographically to be a chief balancer against China in the Indian Ocean.
While working with other navies.
Yes, through joint exercises, particularly with other democratic navies like the US, Japan, Australia. Plus, India's own democracy, despite its challenges, gives it a foundation of stability that Kaplan sees as immeasurable compared to some neighbors.
Okay, so China expanding, India balancing.
Yeah.
Where does the U.S. fit in? Still the dominant power.
Well, yes and no. The U.S. Navy has shrunk quite a bit since the Cold War peak, maybe fewer than 280 ships now compared to over 600 then.
That's a big drop.
It is. But it's still, by far, the reigning hegemon of the seas, as Kaplan puts it. However, and this is crucial, he observes that the post-Cold War unipolar moment for America on the oceans, well, it's starting to fade, meaning other navies, regional navies like China's and India's, indigenous to the area, are finally starting to crowd the picture. It's not just the U.S. Navy ruling the waves unchallenged anymore.
So the U.S. and Chinese navies are sort of sizing each other up.
You could say that. Kaplan talks about them quietly competing and jockeying for position. And this raises a really big strategic question for Washington. Should the U.S. focus on rallying allies against China? Or should it try to pull China into some kind of broader Asian security framework?
That sounds like a tough choice.
It's a major debate.
Okay, let's maybe zoom in on some specific places Kaplan visits. He uses them as microcosms, right? Starting with Oman, he calls it a principal reference point. Why Oman?
Well, geographically, it's where the ocean meets the Arabian Desert. That contrast is really stark. And politically, under Sultan Qaboos bin Said, trod a very unique path.
Sultan Qaboos. Kaplan seemed quite impressed by him.
Deeply. He describes him as having this unusual personal quality, calls him a Renaissance man, someone who managed to bridge Oman's maritime Indian Ocean identity with its desert Arabian one. That's rare.
And strategically located, too, right at the Strait of Hormuz.
Critically so. Which made him, as Kaplan notes, a perfect go-between for the Americans and Iranians, a quiet diplomat. But there was always that lingering concern.
The succession issue.
Exactly. He had no heirs. Kaplan flags that as a major question mark for Oman's future stability after his long rule.
And the Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque Kaplan uses that as an example of Oman's character.
Yes, he sees it reflecting Oman's outward-looking tolerant spirit, built on beauty and proportionality, radiating inclusion. He contrasts it sharply with more rigid, imposing monuments elsewhere, saying it reflects the spirit of the ocean more than of the desert. Quite poetic.
Okay, let's jump across the water to Pakistan, and specifically Gwadar. Kaplan calls it the Gwadar Litmus test. Sounds important.
He frames it as potentially a great place name of the future. The idea is it could be this major hub, a new Silk Route nexus connecting the sea to Central Asia's energy resources via pipeline.
Sounds very ambitious, almost transformative.
Almost. But then come the pitfalls, as Kaplan lays them out. That huge project, instead of benefiting locals, apparently led to a massive land scam.
A land scam.
Yeah, enriching outsiders, disenfranchising the local Baloch people. And this just fueled their resentment towards the central government, which they see as dominated by Punjabis.
So it backfired politically.
Hugely, to the point where Baloch and Sindhi separatists actually started looking towards India as a potential ally against their own government. It's incredibly complex. So the question becomes, will Gwadar ever be that pulsing Rotterdam of the Arabian Sea? or just, another lost city in the sand.
It really shows that big infrastructure projects don't automatically lead to stability or progress for everyone, does it?
Not at all. And Karachi, Pakistan's huge port city, reflects this too. Kaplan sees it as a horizontal city of the future, sprawling outwards, but also full of jarring aesthetics, walls, private security everywhere, radical madrasas gaining influence.
And that leads to his comparison, the nuclearizing Yugoslavia. That sounds terrifying.
It's a chilling phrase. It suggests that Pakistan's internal fractures, the ethnic tensions, the instability combined with its nuclear weapons, pose a risk of fragmentation with potentially catastrophic consequences, far worse even than the breakup of Yugoslavia.
A sobering thought. Okay, moving further east. Bangladesh. Kaplan has some stark descriptions here, too. A perfect microcosm of the perils of democracy in the developing world.
Yes, and even more alarmingly, the most likely spot on the planet for the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in history.
Why so dire?
It's this terrible convergence of factors. You've got climate change hitting hard sea level rise, salt water ruining farmland, less fresh water coming down the rivers.
And this links to politics.
Absolutely. These environmental pressures mix with weak governance, religious extremism, poverty, and remember, you have 150 million people packed into this low-lying delta region. Kaplan notes that, historically, remoteness and fragility of terrain never once corresponded with a paucity of humanity there. It's always been crowded and vulnerable.
Yet he also mentioned some successes.
Paradoxically, yes. They've made strides in reducing population growth, even achieving food self-sufficiency, which is remarkable. But it happens against this backdrop of, pretty dysfunctional central government and intense urban poverty, which unfortunately provides fertile ground for radical ideologies.
It sounds like a country on a knife edge.
Very much so.
All right, let's hop over to Sri Lanka, the island nation caught between India and China.
Its location is everything, strategically speaking. You have the big Chinese-funded port at Hambantota, which we mentioned earlier. And China has historical links there, too, going back centuries. Admiral Zheng, he sailed there in the 1400s.
But the more recent history is tragic, the Civil War.
Terribly tragic. Between the majority Buddhist Sinhalese and the Tamil Tigers fighting for a separate state. Kaplan points out something interesting about the Sinhalese majority having a kind of dangerous minority complex towards the Hindu Tamil minority.
How can a majority have a minority complex?
It sounds odd, but it happens. Even though they're the majority on the island, they might feel culturally or historically threatened by the much larger Tamil population just across the water in India, leading to a kind of defensive, sometimes aggressive nationalism.
And China's role in ending the war.
Kaplan highlights China's approach, what he calls the bleakest form of realism. Basically, China prioritized stability and its own interests, providing support to the Sri Lankan government to crush the Tamil Tigers without the human rights conditions often attached to Western aid. It was effective, brutally so, but offers a stark contrast in approaches to conflict resolution.
So Sri Lanka is basically walking a tightrope between India and China.
That's the takeaway. Kaplan says it will have to maneuver delicately to maintain some kind of functional non-alignment, which makes Sri Lanka, in his view, the ultimate register of geopolitical trends in the whole Indian Ocean. Watching Sri Lanka tells you a lot about the bigger picture.
Fascinating. Okay, next, Burma, or Myanmar. Kaplan frames it as an India-China collision zone.
Right, because it's sandwiched between them, and it's rich in resources. They both want oil, gas, timber, minerals. China, especially, would love it to be a sort of vassal state.
Why a vassal state?
For access. Deep water ports on the Bay of Bengal, pipelines running across Burma to the sea. It would give China's landlocked western regions a vital outlet to the Indian Ocean, bypassing Malacca.
And the U.S. role here seems different. Kaplan talks about these special operators.
Yeah, it's a really interesting section. He describes Americans, like one nicknamed the father of the white monkey, working very informally, almost under the radar, with some of Burma's ethnic minority groups who resist the central government.
What's the significance of that?
Kaplan suggests this kind of low-profile, high-expertise engagement is something the U.S. desperately needs. It's a way to build influence, understand the local dynamics, maybe even balance against China right on its own border, but without a heavy, overt military footprint.
So it's a much more subtle form of competition than, say, aircraft carriers facing off.
Exactly. It underscores the complexity, the ambiguity of how U.S.-China competition actually plays out on the ground in these regions. It's not always obvious.
Okay, let's move to Indonesia. Huge archipelago, straddling key sea lanes. Kaplan mentions the 2004 tsunami's impact.
Yes, particularly in Ace on Sumatra. He talks about how dealing with the aftermath, seeing so much death, was a profound maturing experience for young U.S. Navy personnel involved in the relief effort.
But the aftermath wasn't straightforward. There was a push for stricter Sharia law.
Right. It's quite counterintuitive. Despite massive international aid pouring in, some conservative religious leaders in Asia argued the tsunami was divine punishment for moral laxity, and they pushed for stricter Islamic law as the answer. A kind of reactionary response.
In Indonesia itself, Kaplan calls it a messy empire, not a failed state. What's the difference?
Well, unlike maybe Iraq or Pakistan, which he sees as more fragile, Indonesia, despite being incredibly diverse with 17,000 islands, holds together, albeit messily. Its sheer geographical spread has actually led to power becoming more decentralized over time.
And its form of Islam is different too, tropical Islam.
That's Kaplan's term. He suggests Islam in Indonesia has often been more syncretic, meaning it blends with local traditions and beliefs more adaptable, perhaps, than forms found in parts of the Middle East. He highlights Indonesian Muslim scholars who are actively promoting a more liberal vision of the faith.
But through all this runs the Strait of Malacca, still vital.
Absolutely critical. Kaplan emphasizes that no amount of technological change has lessened the world's dependence on Malacca as a commercial choke point. It remains paramount.
And Indonesia's position regarding the U.S. and China.
It's another balancing act. They seem to welcome the U.S. military presence as a kind of security hedge against China's rising power. But at the same time, they engage closely with China on trade, investment, even defense cooperation.
It's complicated.
Very. And Kaplan points out an irony. Indonesia's successful transition to democracy has actually led to the military playing a smaller role internally. This, he suggests, might paradoxically make Indonesia more vulnerable than ever to Chinese great power intrusion. Less internal focus from the military might mean less capacity to resist external pressures.
That's a fascinating dynamic. Okay, finally, let's swing over to Africa, the western edge of this Indian Ocean world.
Right. Kaplan notes that parts of Africa fronting the Indian Ocean are seeing slow but definite economic growth, and a lot of it is being driven by investment from Asia and the Middle East.
China's influence again.
Definitely. China's hunt for oil is a big factor. They get over a third of their oil imports from Africa now. India is also significantly deepening its engagement across the continent.
Is it all positive?
Kaplan raises concerns. He talks about the fine line between productive investment and exploitation. Some of the deals being struck, particularly for resources, he argues, smack more of old-fashioned colonialism than genuine partnership.
And the issue of piracy off Somalia, still relevant.
Yes, because it illustrates a key point for Kaplan. He sees the piracy not just as random crime, but as the maritime ripple effect of anarchy on land.
Anarchy on land, meaning state failure.
Sort of, but he reframes it. He suggests that what looks like so-called anarchy in places like Somalia might actually be something else. The slow disintegration of states drawn on maps by Europeans, and a return to older, maybe more resilient identities based on clan, tribe, or region.
So the breakdown of colonial borders leading to instability, which spills out onto the sea?
Precisely. It connects the land dynamics directly to maritime security in the Indian Ocean.
Okay, wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground, or rather, water. Bringing this all together, what's the main takeaway from Kaplan's Monsoon?
I think the core message is that the Indian Ocean isn't just this passive body of water, but it's an active, dynamic stage. It's where ancient history, incredibly diverse cultures, raw resources, and crucially, 21st century power politics are all colliding and mixing in really complex ways.
Kaplan calls it a radically interconnected global system.
Exactly. But, and this is key, he also says that within this interconnected system, nationalism will still flourish. It's not one big happy family.
So interdependence alongside fierce national interests.
Precisely. You have astonishing interdependence, yes, but also ferociously guarded sovereignty. Economies were growing, and so are militaries right alongside them. It's a tense mix. The future of American influence, and frankly, global stability, is going to be hugely influenced by what happens in this often underrated maritime region.
So what does all this complexity mean for how you see global politics playing out? We're clearly moving away from a simple unipolar world. The gap between established powers and rising giants like China and India is shrinking. How do the old rules of great power politics even work in this new landscape? Kaplan offers this intriguing idea of a new bourgeoisie, a global middle class.
That might act as a kind of moral force.
Yeah, a force connected by shared economic interests, maybe shared values, that cuts across national borders. Could that change how nations interact? How will power and influence work in a world that Kaplan paints as much more subtle, more ambiguous than the old Cold War map? Something to think about.